They thought he was nobody. They thought he was just another kid to humiliate. But sometimes the quietest figure in the crowd carries a power that no mockery can erase. The afternoon air carried a solemn weight, the kind that pressed into your chest and made every sound sharper. The memorial site was alive with hushed voices, footsteps echoing against the polished stone, and the occasional soft cry that broke the silence like a hairline crack in glass. People had gathered to honor fallen soldiers, their sacrifices carved in the granite walls surrounding the plaza. Yet, amid this reverence, two uniformed officers found entertainment in cruelty. Darius Carter was only 19, his tie knotted too tight, his shoes polished until he could almost see his reflection. He had walked into the memorial with a notebook in his hand, not as a student completing an assignment, but as a son carrying the weight of unspoken stories. His father had served, his grandfather too, and now here he stood, hoping to breathe in the history that had shaped his family. But before he could even take a seat, they saw him. "Hey, kid, you lost?" One of the officers drawled, his voice thick with mock amusement. His partner chuckled, eyeing Darius from head to toe. "What's this, dress rehearsal for court? Were you trying to look smart for once in your life?" The words stung not because they were clever, but because they were sharp with intent. They wanted the crowd to hear, to laugh, to confirm that the young black man in the middle of a sacred gathering was out of place. Darius clenched his jaw, forcing himself to hold still. His mother had taught him, silence could be a shield, and restraint was sometimes the greatest defiance. But silence also burned. His chest tightened with each snicker from the officers, each whisper from the bystanders who chose to look away instead of intervene. He could feel heat creeping up his neck, a wildfire of shame and anger he couldn't show. He wanted to yell, to tell them who he was, to throw the truth in their faces. Yet something inside him resisted an instinct that told him timing was everything. He raised his notebook slightly, as if it were armor. "I'm here for the memorial," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath. The officers laughed harder. "Oh, that's rich. You think this place is for you? Son, you better head back to whatever corner you crawled out of before someone mistakes you for the entertainment." Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few shook their heads, but no one spoke up. The silence of complicity was louder than the officer's mockery. Darius felt the weight of every gaze, every averted eye. The notebook in his hand suddenly seemed fragile, a paper shield against iron. What no one realized, not the officers, not the crowd, not even the students who had come with their professors to observe, was that in the shadow of the memorial stood a woman whose presence could silence armies. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her posture a steel rod of discipline, and the insignia on her uniform carried decades of earned respect. She was Secretary Elaine Carter, the highest-ranking black woman ever to lead the Department of Defense. And she was his mother. She had slipped into the memorial quietly, unwilling to overshadow the occasion with her title. But when she saw her son standing in the crosshairs of prejudice, her heart clenched. Her son had begged her not to make a scene, not to show the world he needed her shield. He wanted to be strong, to face it himself. Yet as she stood there, her fists tightening at her sides, she wondered how much a 19-year-old heart should be asked to endure. Darius lifted his eyes from the officers and fixed them on the wall of names. His father's was etched there, cold and permanent. A man who had fought for the same country, now represented by the uniforms sneering at his son. Instead, he whispered not to them, not to the crowd, but to himself. "I do belong, and you can't take that from me." The words were quiet, but they steadied him. He didn't notice his mother had stepped closer, her gaze fixed like a blade on the officers. He didn't see the security detail hovering at the edges, ready but restrained. All he knew was the battle inside his chest, shame against pride, fury against restraint, despair against resilience. And the battle was only beginning. Darius stood frozen, the insults clinging to his skin like wet cloth. He wanted to shake them off, but the weight only pressed deeper. The laughter of the officers echoed longer than it should have, louder than it deserved. It was as if the entire memorial had been reduced to their cruelty. But something shifted. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle at first. The atmosphere thickened, not just with discomfort, but with an anticipation Darius couldn't name. He didn't realize it was because his mother was moving closer, her heels clicking softly against the stone, each step a quiet declaration of authority. One of the officers smirked, tilting his chin toward Darius. You know, kid, when you stand here looking like that, it's almost like you're mocking the place. Don't think wearing a cheap suit makes you one of them. He pointed toward the wall, toward the carved names of soldiers who had died with honor. You can dress up all you want, but you'll never be part of this story. The cruelty was surgical. It cut past the surface, stabbing into the very marrow of Darius's identity. His father's blood had seeped into foreign soil for this country. His grandfather's hands had carried rifles through wars fought before these officers were even born. And here they stood, declaring him unworthy of memory, unworthy of belonging. His grip on the notebook tightened until the edge dug into his palm. He wanted to shout, to burn their words to ash with truth. But he remembered his father's voice, the last recording he had ever kept. Son, strength isn't just in your fists. Sometimes it's in standing still, holding your ground, refusing to let them push you out. So Darius didn't move. He didn't leave. He lifted his eyes, forcing himself to meet the wall of names again. It was there, etched into the cold granite, that he found the strength his father had left behind. The silence grew heavier. People in the crowd shifted, some pulling out their phones, their screens glowing faintly. A few whispered to each other, debating whether to intervene or film. Darius could feel their indecision like a current in the air. Some wanted justice. Others wanted entertainment. And many wanted only to disappear into anonymity. The second officer stepped closer, his smirk widening. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too scared to speak up because you know you don't belong. Darius opened his mouth, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the air. It was low, firm, and carried a weight that silenced even the officer's laughter. Is that how you honor the fallen? Heads turned instantly. The crowd parted slightly, and there she was, Elaine Carter, the Secretary of Defense. She hadn't raised her voice, yet it carried farther than a shout. Her presence was undeniable, her uniform immaculate, her expression carved from stone. The officers blinked, their smugness faltering for the first time. One stammered, "Ma'am, she didn't let him finish. Answer me." Her eyes were locked on them, sharp and unyielding. Is this your version of respect? Mocking a young man who came here to remember? The officers stiffened, but the arrogance in their posture hadn't completely dissolved. They didn't yet realize who she was. To them, she was simply a commanding black woman, and that alone seemed to provoke a flicker of defensiveness. "Ma'am," the first officer said, trying to recover, "we were just making sure he wasn't causing trouble. You know how it is. We can't be too careful." Her eyes narrowed. Trouble? By standing still? By holding a notebook? She stepped closer, her heels striking like punctuation. "Do you know who this young man is?" The officers exchanged glances. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held, waiting for the reveal. Darius's heart pounded. He hadn't wanted wanted his mother to step in. But now it was unfolding in a way no one could stop. The officer chuckled nervously. "No, ma'am, we don't." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look at Darius. She kept her eyes pinned on them, like a hawk on prey. "Then let me enlighten you. This is my son, and the man whose name you just used to belittle him? That was his father, a decorated soldier who gave his life for the freedoms you claim to protect." The silence cracked into murmurs, shock flooding the crowd. Phones lifted higher, recording every syllable. The officers' faces drained of color, but their shame was too late. The moment was captured, immortalized in pixels and whispers. Darius felt heat crawl up his neck, not from humiliation this time, but from the sudden blaze of attention. He hadn't wanted this. He had wanted to fight his own battles, to prove he didn't need the shield of his mother's title. But seeing her there, fierce and unyielding, stirred something else in him. It wasn't dependency, it was recognition. Recognition that he was not alone. The officer's lips trembled. "Secretary Carter, we didn't," she cut him off. "Didn't what? Didn't think? Didn't recognize your prejudice when it spilled out of your mouth." Her voice sharpened, slicing through the pretense. "Every soldier whose name is carved into this wall deserves better than to have their sacrifice overshadowed by your ignorance." The crowd erupted not in laughter this time, but in applause. It began with a single pair of hands, then spread like wildfire until the plaza was filled with clapping, cheers, and shouts of support. Darius's chest swelled, his shame dissolving into something stronger, pride. His mother finally turned to him, her eyes softening. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You belong here, Darius. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Tears pricked his eyes, but he held them back. For the first time in that agonizing confrontation, he allowed himself a small smile. The officers stood frozen, their authority stripped, their arrogance exposed. They had wanted to make an example of him. Instead, they had made an example of themselves. And though the moment would be replayed on screens and in conversations for weeks to come, for Darius, it wasn't about the spectacle. It was about the truth his mother had carved into that day as clearly as the names on the wall. He did belong. And his story, his family's story, was part of the legacy that could never be mocked away. But the story was far from over. Because power doesn't just reveal. It demands reckoning. The applause faded slowly, leaving a silence that was different from before. It was no longer the silence of complicity or cowardice. It was charged, expectant, heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had just happened. The officers stood stiff, their faces pale beneath the sunlight, their arrogance peeled away like old paint. Darius shifted, still gripping his notebook, unsure if he wanted to vanish or to stand taller than ever. His mother didn't move immediately. Elaine Carter's gaze swept over the crowd, her eyes meeting those of the bystanders who had remained quiet when the mockery began. She didn't need to say a word. The shame already lived in their faces. People who had chosen silence now wrestled with the knowledge of their own inaction. She wanted them to feel it, not to punish them, but to remind them that silence, too, is a weapon when aimed in the wrong direction. Then, with deliberate calm, she faced the officers again. "You owe him an apology," she said simply. The first officer swallowed hard. His lips parted, but the words seemed to choke in his throat. The second shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against the brim of his hat as if searching for an anchor. Finally, in a voice that trembled, the first officer muttered, "We're sorry." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Say it to him." The officer's jaw tightened, but he turned toward Darius. I'm sorry," he said, his voice reluctant, forced. Darius looked at him, the apology hanging between them like a flimsy bridge over a canyon. For a moment, he considered spitting the words back, telling him that an apology given under pressure meant nothing. But then he thought of his father, thought of the lessons of dignity passed down through pain. He nodded slightly, not accepting, not forgiving, but acknowledging. The second officer followed with his own apology, quieter and just as hollow. The crowd didn't applaud this time. They didn't cheer. They simply watched, the weight of the scene pressing on them like gravity. Elaine stepped closer to her son. Her hand brushed against his arm briefly, a touch filled with more reassurance than any words could provide. "Let's go," she whispered. But as they began to move, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "Wait, please." It was a young woman, no older than Darius, her hands clutching her phone. Can we hear from him?" The crowd shifted again, murmurs rising. Dozens of phones were already aimed at him, recording, streaming, capturing. Darius froze, his throat tightening. He had never wanted the spotlight, and now it was blinding. Elaine looked at him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't pushing him forward, but she wasn't pulling him back either. The choice, she knew, had to be his. Darius felt the weight of every eye on him. His heart pounded against his ribs, his palms damp with sweat. He wanted to run. But then he remembered the wall, the names, the legacy that pulsed beneath his skin. He remembered the sting of mockery, the silence of bystanders, and the fire in his mother's voice. He lifted his chin slowly. "I didn't come here to speak," he began, his voice low but steady. The crowd hushed instantly, leaning closer. "I came here to listen, to remember, to honor people who gave everything, including my father. But I guess sometimes, no matter what you wear, no matter where you stand, people still look at you and decide you don't belong." His words carried farther than he expected, echoing against the stone. He saw heads nodding, eyes widening, tears forming. He took a shaky breath and continued. "I could have shouted back. I could have fought. But then I'd just be what they wanted me to be, a problem, a threat, a headline. Instead, I stood here. I stayed. Because this place doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the names on that wall. It belongs to every family who's lost someone. It belongs to all of us." He paused, his voice tightening. "My father's name is there. And when you laugh at me for standing here, you're laughing at him. You're laughing at everyone who gave their lives. And I won't let that stand. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of shame, of awakening. Darius swallowed, his voice softening. I'm 19. I don't have the answers. But I know this. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't depend on skin color, or status, or what someone thinks you deserve. Respect is the bare minimum. And if we can't give that to each other here, in a place built on sacrifice, then what are we even honoring? The words hit like a drumbeat, steady and undeniable. When he stopped, the crowd erupted again. This time, it wasn't polite applause. It was a roar, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls of the memorial and rose into the sky. People clapped, cheered, shouted his name. Darius's knees felt weak, his chest heavy with both fear and release. He hadn't planned those words, hadn't rehearsed. They had come from the rawest part of him, a place that had been waiting too long to speak. Elaine's hand touched his shoulder again, firmer this time. Pride glistened in her eyes, but so did something else, relief. She leaned in and whispered, "Your father would have been proud." He swallowed hard, nodding, unable to speak. The officers slinked back into the shadows, their presence diminished, their power broken. The crowd no longer looked at them. Their authority had been replaced by disgrace. And as the applause surged, Darius realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger. It was about every student, every child, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. His voice had carried theirs, if only for a moment. As the crowd began to settle, reporters pushed forward, questions flying. Elaine raised her hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "This isn't a press conference," she said firmly. "This is a memorial. Let's not forget why we're here." Her words redirected the energy, grounding it back into reverence. Slowly, people turned again toward the wall, some with tears in their eyes, others with newfound resolve. Darius exhaled, finally lowering his notebook. He had thought it was his shield, but he realized now it was something else, a witness, a record. He opened it quietly, scribbling down the words he had just spoken. He wanted them preserved, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for himself. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the plaza, mother and son stood together, side by side, facing the wall of names. Elaine's hand rested over her heart. Darius's eyes lingered on his father's name, his lips moving in a silent promise. He would not let the mockery define him. He would let the memory guide him. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of purpose began to take root. The crowd eventually thinned, but the moment refused to fade. Darius walked beside his mother through the stone archway of the memorial, the weight of what had happened still pressing against his ribs. His suit felt heavier than before, as though every thread had absorbed the stares, the insults, and the applause. Elaine said little at first. Her silence wasn't cold. It was deliberate, giving her son the space to process. She had learned long ago, both as a soldier and as a mother, that sometimes words could suffocate when the heart needed air. Finally, when they reached the quiet edge of the plaza, she spoke. "You stood taller than I could have asked, Darius." He shook his head, clutching the notebook at his side. "I didn't feel tall. I felt small, like they could crush me any second. If you hadn't been there, but I was there," she interrupted gently. She stopped walking, turning to face him. "And not because you needed me to fight for you. You did that yourself. I was there because you're my son, and I will always stand where you stand. That's not weakness. That's family." Her words cut through the haze of doubt clouding his chest. Still, the knot inside him wasn't fully undone. "But Mom, I don't want people to think I only belong because of you. Because of your title." Elaine's eyes softened. She placed her hand against his cheek, her thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. "Then show them otherwise. Show them through your work, your words, your choices. You already did today. Belonging isn't given, it's claimed. And you claimed it." Her conviction was unshakable. It seeped into him like sunlight, warming the parts of him that had grown cold. For the first time since the officers had mocked him, he felt something other than shame or fury. He felt possibility. By the time they reached the car waiting at the curb, the news had already spread. Reporters shouted from a distance, cameras flashing, microphones stretched out like hungry mouths. Darius wanted to duck, to hide, but Elaine didn't. She opened the car door and looked at him with a quiet challenge in her eyes. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to. But if you do, make sure it's yours, not theirs." Darius hesitated, then turned. The crowd of reporters loomed, their voices colliding into a single demand. "What happened? What do you have to say?" He stepped forward, his hands trembling but his spine straight. The microphones pressed closer, the red lights of cameras blinking like watchful eyes. He drew in a breath. "I don't have a speech," he said, his voice carrying despite its softness. "I just have a truth. Today, I was mocked for being here, for daring to stand in a place where my father's name is written, for existing as I am. But I stayed, because my father stayed, until his last breath. Because this memorial doesn't belong to hate. It belongs to sacrifice, to dignity, to unity, and no one gets to take that away." The reporters fell silent, stunned by the simplicity of his words. Darius turned without waiting for follow-up questions and slid into the car beside his mother. He had said enough. That night, the story spread like wildfire. Clips of the officers sneering, of Elaine's fierce confrontation, of Darius's trembling yet resolute voice, all of it flooded the airwaves and the internet. People argued, debated, condemned. Some praised his courage. Others twisted his words, trying to diminish him. But no matter how it was spun, the truth was out. A young black student had stood against ridicule, and in doing so, forced a nation to look at itself in the mirror. At school the next day, Darius felt the stares. Some were admiring, others awkward, a few resentful. His professors whispered in hallways, students pointed in cafeterias. He had become a symbol overnight, and symbols are rarely treated as human. But in the quiet moments, when friends pulled him aside to say, "You gave me hope," or when strangers emailed him stories of their own humiliation and resilience, Darius realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. His voice had connected to others. His pain had become shared. His story was no longer just his, it was part of something larger. Still, doubt lingered. Late at night, he replayed the scene in his mind, wondering if he had truly done enough, if his silence before speaking had looked like weakness. But then he remembered the applause, the nods, the shift in the air when his words landed. Change was slow, uneven, often invisible, but it had begun. Elaine watched her son quietly in those days, resisting the urge to shield him from the world's harshness. She knew he had stepped into a role he hadn't asked for, but couldn't escape. And though it terrified her as a mother, it also filled her with pride. Because she had raised not just a survivor, but a witness, a truth-teller. Weeks later, the officers who had mocked Darius were suspended pending investigation. Their arrogance had cost them not just dignity, but careers. Yet Elaine knew the true victory wasn't their punishment. It was the conversation that had sparked in living rooms, classrooms, and offices across the country. People were asking themselves, what would I have done in that crowd? Would I have stayed silent? Would I have spoken up? And in that questioning, change began to breathe. Months passed, and Darius returned to the memorial one quiet morning, this time alone. The plaza was nearly empty, the air crisp with dawn. He walked slowly, the sound of his shoes echoing against the stone. When he reached his father's name, he knelt, placing his notebook gently against the wall. The pages inside were filled now not just with his own words, but with letters and stories sent to him by strangers. Stories of injustice, of resilience, of hope. He had kept them all, carrying them like lanterns in the dark. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for all this, but I'll try. For you. For Mom. For everyone who ever stood here and felt small." The sun rose slowly, spilling golden light across the stone, across his face, across the pages of the notebook. It was the same light that had witnessed his humiliation, the same light that had crowned his defiance. Now, it bathed him in warmth, as if the memorial itself acknowledged his presence. He stood, straightening his shoulders. He wasn't just a student anymore. He wasn't just the son of the Secretary of Defense. He was Darius Carter, a young man who had been mocked, who had been doubted, but who had claimed his belonging in the face of cruelty. And as he walked away from the wall, the golden light followed, stretching his shadow long across the plaza. It was not the shadow of shame, but of legacy. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones shouted from podiums, but the ones born from silence, from standing firm when the world tries to push you out. Darius's story was one of those, and it would not be forgotten. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.